Okay, hello everyone. I'm Roger Waldinger. I'm professor of sociology at UCLA, director of the Center for the Study of International Migration. I'm delighted to welcome you to this winter session of the talks that we've been sponsoring with our friends and colleagues at UC San Diego's Center for Comparative Immigration Studies. Also, of course, want to wish you a Happy New Year, and I hope that you are all staying healthy and safe and managing during these very difficult times. Hopefully they will come to an end reasonably soon, but none of us know. So, and I suppose one of the few upsides of COVID is that it has allowed us to transition to this different environment, and which provides us, makes it easy for us to have an event such as today. We're delighted to be able to begin with a session focusing on Brexitland, and to have the two authors, Rob Ford and Maria Sobolewska, with us today. And let me just say, before turning the session over to them, just a little advertising on what's going to happen. We will have 4 further book sessions this quarter. The next one will be on February 4th, featuring Myrna Safi, who's a professor at Sciences Po in Paris, talking about her book, Migration and Inequality, with a comment by Andres Villarreal of our sociology department at UCLA. 3 other sessions, 3 other book sessions, a workshop to take for graduate students on record linkage in immigration research, and then a talk by Professor Nancy Green on transnationalism. So without further ado, I want to turn the session over to Rob Ford and Maria Sobolewska. They'll present their book, Brexitland. It'll be followed by a comment from Professor Michael Thies of the UCLA Department of Political Science. Then the floor will go back to Rob and Maria for brief reactions, and then we'll turn it open to everybody for Q&A. And we'll continue for an hour and a half. Okay, so Rob and Maria, the floor is yours. Looking forward to hearing about the book.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you so much for having us. And yes, this is a great kind of bonus of this horrible pandemic, that we can actually communicate more easily across all borders. So yes, without further ado, our book is called Brexitland: Identity, Diversity and the Reshaping of British Politics. And we think that we are making an intervention in the debate about Brexit by trying to ground Brexit in long-term social and political change that has been happening in Great Britain ever since the Second World War. And we are trying to resist some shorter-term explanations, but embed them in this longer-term perspective. So as you will have probably noticed, our title, the title of the book is inspired by a book on American politics called Nixonland by Rick Perlstein, who has described a rise of President Nixon by trying to explore how America got divided, how did it get polarized. And so he has this extremely resonant quote here, which when we read it again after Brexit, we felt this was absolutely applicable to Britain. We are having now 2 groups staring at each other from behind a common divide, each equally convinced of its own righteousness, and each equally convinced that the other group was defined by its evil. And that kind of normative load in these divisions is not an accident. It is actually something you could really see in British politics after the referendum. This is just an example of the kinds of front page news that we encountered after the referendum. People who voted to remain were being called Remoaners. Judges who wanted to make sure that the process is lawful were called saboteurs. And we were invited to crush them. And on the other side of the fence, when the Tory party, when the Conservative Party came to Manchester, where we are from, and currently came for their annual party conference, they were welcomed by this sign hanging off the bridge, hang the Tories. And just to make sure there's no misunderstandings, there are actually effigies of Tories in their Oxford Subfask hanging from that bridge. So the hatred, the moral judgment on each other was very palpable. But where did it all come from? We said that we wanted to go back into British political history to find the answer to that. But we actually start the book with demographics, because we feel that what has gone unnoticed for a very long time is that the kind of society in which Brexit could happen was not the kind of society that got studied and looked at for decades of political science in Britain. And because this change was so slow, we haven't noticed that we are now looking at a completely different society. And of course, demographics have impacts on politics, and very real one. So we focused on two main kind of demographic changes. The first one was educational expansion. This graph just shows you basically that we only had about 7% people who went to university as recently as 1985, whereas now we actually have more people going to university than people leaving school with no qualification. So we have a complete swap around in terms of what people expect as a new normal in terms of their educational experience. The second big demographic change that happened after the Second World War was, of course, the huge meteoric rise of ethnic diversity. So, of course, Britain has always been a country with multiple immigrants, and many of them were, in fact, of non-white origins. But the kind of increase that we have witnessed since has been very significant. And finally, the third demographic change is that these two previous changes, so the educational change and diversity change, racial diversity change, wasn't happening everywhere at the same time. And this is just an example using racial diversity, just to show, this is a graph showing an increase in ethnic diversity between the two censuses in 2001 and 2011. And what it shows you is the areas that were not diverse, so the little graph at the bottom, didn't become a lot more diverse in that decade. However, the places that were already quite diverse became hugely more so, by a quarter rise in ethnic demographic diversity. So what we can see here, and the same is true for education, is that we have a country that is changing, but it's not changing evenly everywhere. And at the same time as we had those huge demographic changes that have gone largely unnoticed politically until Brexit really brought them home for us, we also had long-term political change. And that, of course, got noticed a little bit more. But the first one of the ones that we describe in the book is that parties have started leaving voters. And what has happened is that the parties, especially the Labour Party, decided that it needed to become more centralized on economics to attract a wider range of voters. And so 1997 was this big watershed election where we basically, that marked the fact that the two main parties in a two-party system, of course, have been so close that voters started saying they cannot see any difference between them. And it wasn't just on economics, it wasn't just on programs. What also happened is that parties started looking the same in terms of who they had on their benches in parliament. And education here in particular is very important. In 1992, as an example, the Labour Party, almost 30% of the representatives of Labour in parliament were actually school leavers, just like the society that they represented. However, now it is under 10%. Okay, so 90% of Labour MPs not only have a degree, 40% of them have a postgraduate degree. And of course, all the parties are the same. All the politicians from all the parties have started becoming a little bit identikit. And of course, another change that happened is that we modernized our political campaigning, and that added to this feeling that parties were leaving voters behind, because modernization meant that the campaigns became a lot more targeted and a lot more oriented around effects and being efficient. And so what has happened is that these kind of areas where the party didn't feel that they can win got completely abandoned. And now more than 50% of British people say they don't receive any personal contact from political parties. And a statistic from the book here is that in 1959, Labour has spent 70% of their available legal limits of spending, campaign spending, in Conservative safe seats. So these were seats where they had no chance of winning. But in 2010, that figure was 20%. So it's a huge fall in the budget. They no longer go and talk to these voters at all. And of course, when we talk about education, we know education impacts political values. And this is one of the reasons why it is such a crucial demographic change. But of course, the fact that our elites have become more educated even faster than our society also produce the kind of the final nail in the coffin of the linkage between parties and the electorates, which is that on values that opened this huge elite mass gap. And one example that we use throughout the book actually is this question about whether opportunities for minorities, for ethnic minorities, have gone too far. And as you can see here, already in 1992, both the left-wing, kind of liberal left-wing parties in Britain had an enormous gap of more than 20% on this item. So the voters did actually, some of them think that the opportunities went too far, and almost none of their MPs did. The Conservative Party in 1992 still to some extent represented those voters, because the candidates of this party for political office also agreed that ethnic minorities have gone too far. However, this has almost completely disappeared by 2010. And so unsurprisingly, the second long-term political change is that after the parties have left voters, the voters started leaving parties as well. This is a graph showing you the decline, the scale of the decline of partisanship in Britain in that period of time from the late 80s to 2010s. And here you can see that the strong partisanship has declined so much that in fact we have now fewer people who say they are strong partisans of any party than people who have no partisanship whatsoever. So how did all these long-term demographic changes and those long-term political changes translate into the kind of identity politics that finally exploded into Brexit? So we have kind of two big points to make in the book. One is that when we think about how this demographic change impacted on political values, we are often limited by the kind of values that surveys give us. And one of the ones that is absolutely undermeasured and underrepresented in British academia is ethnocentrism. This value of ethnocentrism, or rather a tendency, is a very important one because it provides us with a direct theoretical link between people who are very attached to in-groups and are very hostile to out-groups. Of course, they will feel this way about things like immigration and ethnic diversity, because these are the kind of primeval outgroups that there are. But we also think that one of the blind spots of the existing British literature was that we only spoke about those ethnocentric people, people who didn't like immigrants, people who didn't like ethnic minorities. But there is a growing group of people, those highly educated people, those minority people who actually love diversity and value it. And we measure this with anti-prejudice norms in our book, but this is something that we think should be developed further. And the second part of the contribution that we think we're making with this book is we're trying to show the light onto how this ethnocentrism and this value, this newly mobilized political value, gets activated and mobilized into politics.
Me next?
Yes, you next.
Oh, slightly early.
Yeah.
We tag team these things,
Yeah.
so we do. Maria, that's the first half. I did the second half. Sometimes it's the other way around. So I'm coming in slightly earlier than expected, but in terms of how those two features of our argument link together, the demographic element and the element of value orientations, we basically in our book delineate three groups in the electorate. And obviously this is a major simplification. All these things are, tendencies, not absolutes, but for the sake of argument, we kind of develop three ideal types. The first is identity conservatives, which is demographically, it's white voters with lower education levels who very consistently tend to show stronger ethnocentric tendencies across the board in terms of attitudes to ethnic minorities, in terms of attitudes to, say, British Muslims, in terms of attitudes to immigration, in terms of national identity beliefs, and so on. The second coalition, what we call the identity liberal coalition, is actually two distinct groups. You have white university educated, what we call conviction liberals. These are people for whom anti-racism, cosmopolitanism, openness, these are important central values to them. These are the kinds of things they want to see their politicians delivering in politics. But then allied with them, but quite distinct in their motivations, are ethnic minority voters themselves. This is a really important difference that often gets missed in this debate. Ethnic minority voters are not necessarily socially liberal, even on identity politics issues. They're often quite identity conservative. They're often suspicious of outgroups themselves. But they align very consistently with white identity liberals because they know that if identity politics gets mobilized, it will be mobilized against them. That the kind of ethnocentrism they see in the majority population is the kind of ethnocentrism that they are likely to be targeted by. So they have a strong sort of group-based motivation to align with the value-driven motivation of white identity liberals. Now, that's the sort of story of, I mean, in the book we use an analogy of a forest fire. It can take a long time, fuel building up, but it takes a spark to make a fire happen. So this kind of fuel in terms of distinctive value divisions in the electorate was building up for a long time. But the story I'm going to tell in the second half of the talk is about how this ignited into a new kind of politics and political mobilization, party division, and so forth. And at the heart of this story is immigration politics in the UK. Immigration, it is important to emphasize, is one of the issues that most deeply divides the groups that we're talking about. Here, for example, I'm showing the education divide. This is the share of voters who hold positive views of immigration and its impact on British society. You'll see that large shares of graduates, close to 2/3 majorities of graduates in recent years, say immigration is a positive force in British society, whereas it's more like 1/3 of voters with GCSE education or less. Now, that's really critical because starting in the early 2000s, immigration rose to the top of the political agenda and then stayed there for 20 years. That had never happened before in British politics, and it was driven by the fact that we had sustained and very large inflows of immigration all the way through this period. This was the period where Britain experienced the most immigration in its history to date. However, this then interacted with an earlier political alignment that was the product of an earlier period of migration. Much of the British ethnic minority population can trace its origins in Britain back to post-war migration from the post-colonial independent states that in the first half of the 20th century and the 19th century were often part of the British Empire. All of the citizens of those states, all of them without exception, were granted formal citizenship rights in Britain in 1948, meaning that in theory, the entire population of India could have moved to Britain, set up families here, worked here, voted here from the day they arrived. It was an extraordinarily liberal piece of legislation, although the people who made it didn't realize that at the time. And there was a substantial wave of migration into Britain through people exercising those rights. And there was a substantial ethnocentric reaction from the white population in response to that. And critically, that ethnocentric reaction was mobilized by one of the political parties via the figure of Enoch Powell in the late 1960s and early 1970s. He did an infamous speech in 1968 where he said that immigration and ethnic change was like watching a nation busily heaping up its own funeral pyre. From that point onwards, for 30 years, anti-immigration or ethnocentric voters, when asked, would say that the Conservative Party were the party most likely to deliver the kind of policy outcomes that they wanted. And that remained the case all the way through until David Cameron took office in 2010. Possibly one of the most consequential policy pledges of the last 50 years was David Cameron's pledge to bring immigration down to the tens of thousands. It was a specific numerical pledge, which it was completely impossible to deliver upon while Britain remained a member state of the European Union, something that Cameron and his colleagues must have known when they made this pledge. Now, in the 3 years after he took office in 2010, the Conservative Party's rating on immigration, where they'd been miles ahead of Labour for the best part of 50 years, collapsed. It was an engine of destruction. Every time immigration statistics were published, all of the anti-immigration press here would criticize him and say he's continuing to fail to deliver. And where did those voters go in terms of who did they say could solve the problem of immigration now? Well, that's this line, the UK Independence Party, the party that was saying the only way you're going to get what you want on immigration and much else besides is if you leave the EU. And during the same period, something else happened in public opinion, which is that voters came to see the problem of immigration and the problem of EU membership as linked. That was not the case before the mid-2000s. By the time Cameron had been in office for a couple of years, it was the case that there was a more or less one-to-one link between support for reducing immigration and support for withdrawing from the EU. Meanwhile, what are Labour up to in opposition? Well, they are wrestling with the other side of the identity politics dilemma. They recognised that immigration was now an issue that was concerning to a lot of voters, in particular, low education, older white voters with whom the party was struggling, but with whom the party was traditionally strong. But on the other hand, appealing to those voters with promises of tougher policies on immigration would tend to inflame their rising new electorate of values-based identity liberals who would regard those kinds of policies as pandering to things like racism and nationalism and as therefore being unacceptable. And so you saw years of kind of red-on-red potshots here. Immigration makes Britain great, pandering to the right doesn't work, shabby Labour is pandering to prejudice, that's one side of the argument. We should stop obsessing about diversity, we need to listen to immigration concerns, we've got to get out of our bubble and listen to anti-immigration voters. This was a near endless debate in the Labour Party during this period. And it is not just about immigration. That's really critical to our argument. Immigration is simply the lightning rod for a broader division over the changes in society and their relation to groups and in-group, out-group politics and so on. So you see the same kinds of divisions also opening up in terms of attitudes to ethnic minorities, as we mentioned earlier on in the talk. And so where we have ended up, even before Brexit, is a situation where you had two British identities, two groups of Britons staring at each other from behind a common divide, with apologies to Rick Perlstein here, each equally convinced of its own righteousness and each equally convinced that the other group was defined by its evil. Because it's important to emphasize, these were emotionally and normatively hot arguments. People were getting very worked up about these things. Charges of pandering to racism, of being racist, were being thrown around a lot, and those charges carry a lot of weight. Now, the question this obviously prompts is, well, where did Brexit come into this? Well, are these groups now leave and remain? And the answer is, to some extent, yes, they are. One of the things that Brexit did to Britain is it essentially forged new identities. It gave people the ability to name something that they saw out there in society, but previously didn't have a name for. Now, if you are a socially conservative voter, an ethnocentric voter, you can just point at people and go, Ramona. You're a Remainer, you're a liberal, that's exactly how I would expect you to think. Similarly, if you're a conviction liberal, pro-migration voter, you will call people leavers, and it's basically shorthand for a certain kind of intolerant voter. These things have become incredibly strongly lodged in the minds of voters. And that's what this graph is showing. Far more voters in Britain now identify in the sort of traditional social identity sense of saying we, not they. If this group is criticised, it feels like a personal insult to me. Leave and Remain partisanship is now much stronger than Conservative and Labour partisanship, which, as we saw, was in decline even before Brexit. And you see this also in perceptions of each other. Both groups see themselves as, say, reasonable, and see the other side as intolerance, each equally convinced of its own righteousness, each equally convinced of the other side's evil. So what Brexit did was essentially mobilize these latent divides and forge them into new identities. Now, final questions to leave you with for conversation. Where are we going next? Obviously, a lot has happened in British politics since Brexit. The 2019 election accelerated this process of realigning voters around these new identities. But what's not clear is whether or not that new alignment is a temporary product of a period in which identity issues were unusually salient on the political agenda. So, for example, the salience of immigration has collapsed, or whether or not this is going to be a permanent alignment reflected in really persistent social identities. There's also a demographic question here. Both parties face difficult dilemmas because the changes which produced this confluence of political circumstances are continuing, indeed accelerating. Britain is continuing to become an electorate with more graduates, with more ethnic minority voters. And the parties have to think about how they wrestle with that. Now those things are very much structural within the political system. And the third area, and the area which perhaps we can learn most for good and ill from the American context, is how the mobilization of these kinds of identity attachments and identity divisions will disrupt debates over policy. If we end up in a situation where so much is seen through the lens of in-groups and out-groups, what will that mean for how we conduct debate about different kinds of policies? Will policies start to be seen not in terms of what they deliver, but in terms of who gains and who loses for them? That's certainly, for the two of us, one of the big concerns going forward. So that's it from us. Exactly to time, I'm pleased to say. So we'll hand over to our very kind discussant now.
Okay, terrific. So thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. Mike, the floor is yours.
Okay, let me get my slides up here. And then share screen. I'm trying to figure out which thing I'm supposed to be looking at here. Okay, I think this works. Can you see the just the presentation, or can you see everything?
Everything.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I don't care. All right. Well, thank you very much. When Roger invited me to discuss this book, I told Maria and Rob earlier, I had heard of the book. It was something I wanted to read, and I just never have time to read things I want to read. So I was glad to do it. He got me the book in early December. I immediately read chapter 1, then got swamped with finishing up last term, preparing for this term, got back to the book last week, read the whole book, and then yesterday decided I need to go back and look at the first couple chapters again. I ended up reading the whole book again, which is an advertisement to everybody who hasn't had a chance to read it. It's a great read. It's really clear. It's the sort of thing you could assign to your undergraduates, and makes a very compelling case, as Maria and Rob just presented. So flattery done. Let me move on to some questions. And all of these are sort of, I would put in the context of the idea that this book is the sort of book that should launch 1,000 dissertations, that it opens up a lot of questions, some of which Rob articulated, you'll see on my slides too, himself. But really, this is pointing us in a lot of different fruitful directions, I think, for future research on the UK and in comparative sort of perspective as well. So these are the are you seeing my outline now, or are you seeing still my title page? The outline? Okay, I'm just not sure what for some reason for me, it's on two different screens. So I'll just, okay. So these are the points I'm going to try to get to. I may run out of time and not to get to all of them. But I do hope at some point someone will explain how in the world the Labour Party that Rob and Maria describe in this book shows Jeremy Corbyn. He confuses me. So first, path dependence. The way that Rob, I think it was Rob described in the presentation today, that what happened in the 2000s to 2010s, the reaction that occurred in British politics built on the first wave of mass migration that happened as a result of the British National Act, or what it was called, the BNA. In the sense that Britain in the 2010s was a much more diverse place than it had been in the previous generation, and so you had these debates about the impact of immigration that had been going on, and it was just it had set a different stage around the time of what became Brexit than earlier in politics. There are places in the book where even the phrase is used, path dependence, and that's a phrase that always kind of troubles me because it can imply, although I think the authors are careful in their narrative, it can imply that things started to become inevitable, that leaders didn't really have choices to make, or they were forced. They didn't see any other way to do things. There is a line in the book about Cameron's decision to call the referendum as being showed that this is the only way he could see out of this divide he had in the party, and the threat of UKIP was, this is the only way to solve this problem. And I've just always kind of raised my eyebrow when I see statements like that. It's like, well, you always have a choice. And so I've just listed a bunch here that are discussed in the narrative where you could imagine leaders making different decisions and wonder sort of what would have happened had they made those different decisions. Now, it could be that a given leader at a given time could have made a different decision, but a year later, the pressure would have been that much higher to make the opposite decision. But I always kind of want to question and interrogate these ideas that, well, X, Y, and Z had happened, so the next thing sort of was inevitable. And what were the decisions were made? So one that comes up in particular was when Enoch Powell made his speech, sort of set himself up as the martyr for identity conservatives. The party didn't remove the whip, right? They fired him from the front bench, but sent him back to the back benches, but he was still in the party. The party kind of free rode on his anti-immigration street cred. They could have their cake and eat it too, right? That he's no longer in the leadership, but we benefit from his reputation as an immigration hawk. And so for those of you who like that, you'll vote Tory. Labor could have tried to outbid the conservatives, right? I mean, as you discuss throughout the book, a big part of the labor constituency was these identity conservatives. So why didn't labor choose to double down and sort of outbid Enoch Powell, as opposed to take the opposite and become the party of sort of liberal views on immigration? So there are a bunch of these. I won't read through all of them at once. Another question that came up several times was sort of the extent to which immigration and the placement or the priority of immigration on the agenda was an exogenous event that political leaders just had to deal with, or whether there's a big story of sort of what you might think of as kind of identity entrepreneurs among party leaders. Certainly Enoch Powell, maybe Margaret Thatcher, Nigel Farage for sure, trying to use this to mobilize, to frame issues around an issue that they thought they owned and could benefit from, right? And the last thing I have here about selection bias is one wonders how many stories there are of failed attempts to do that, of identity entrepreneurs trying to reframe some issue and people just not buying it. And so then politics not polarizing the way that it did over Brexit or something like that. To tell a sort of coherent narrative, especially one that deals with such a span of time, you kind of have to stick to your main story and just describe what happened and try to explain it. But as a political scientist, you always are tempted to say, well, what's the counterfactual? Or are there examples of failed attempts to do the same thing, and why did those fail? And why did the ones that succeeded to frame things around immigration or whatever it might be succeed? Okay, so the extent to which immigration just sort of appeared on the agenda, and the extent to which it was placed on the agenda by political actors who saw an advantage in it. And then why were they able actually to convince everyone that that was the proper frame for discussing whatever the topic was, whether it was the EU or not. I just want to, this is just one of those future dissertation advice for any grad students who might be listening. This is a story about the UK, right? And a lot of the details are about British politics, British institutions. There's discussion in the book about how, for example, the first past the post electoral system can be problematic or can skew our view of outcomes, because we just see seat shares and we don't concentrate enough on vote shares. But then even vote shares are endogenous because it's, I guess, what the Brits call tactical voting. For some reason, we call it strategic voting. No, voting not for your first choice because you think your first choice doesn't have a chance to win, so you vote for the lesser of the two viable evils. And so then what is the actual sincere sort of level of party support? And that's difficult to see. But one might also think, and we can see this across Europe, that in systems that use, say, proportional representation, electoral rules, it could be that some of these identity conservative niche parties, what we sometimes call radical right parties, that their introduction into the party system is more gradual, right? One of the things about Brexit, about Trump in the US is because we have this very majoritarian rules, the only way you can really make a big splash is by taking over one of the big parties, right? The UK does have small parties. UKIP showed up. UKIP is this great example of a party that in elections lost every battle and then somehow on their main issue won the war. But it sort of things build, and this is one of the virtues of this book is to say, look, Brexit didn't just come out of nowhere, right? It was building, it was building, it was building. There was a spark, and then the Tories, became the party of Brexit. In a proportional representation system that allows for many more parties to exist in the system simultaneously, you might see these sorts of things happen more gradually. So in some of the continental European countries, you see these parties that win 5-6% of the seats sort of regularly, maybe rise a little bit in certain times and fall in other times. And so you're not as shocked by what's going on. But then it's also a very different sort of coalitional game. And the mainstream parties have to decide, are we going to entertain the idea of working together with these radical right parties? Are we going to invite them to be coalition partners? And it's less a game of sort of, is this external threat threatening our internal harmony, right? So the Tories, for example, had to worry, were they going to lose votes and seats to UKIP? And more, each party is a little bit more homogeneous, but then they have to coalesce with each other to govern. But it's a little bit more explicit. It's a little, it's just a different game in politics. Another feature that's implicit in a discussion of British politics is just the structure, the constitutional structure of the UK. And two things about that. One is that it's very centralized, right? All power in the United Kingdom is in Westminster. And it's a unicameral parliament where there's usually a single party that has a majority, not always, but usually. The House of Lords is mostly irrelevant. There's no separately elected president. So if you capture the majority in the House of Commons, you can basically do what you want. The caveat, and another interesting constitutional feature that's brought up in chapter 9 in the book is devolution. So these local or regional parliaments for Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales that have some powers. A previous student of mine, part of her dissertation was looking at the Blair government's decision to devolve power. And she thought that part of what was going on, particularly with respect to Scotland, was that Blair knew he wanted to move Labour to the center. He wanted to compete with the Tories in England. But he wasn't going to be able to get away with that in Scotland if he moved to the center. And so devolution was a way of sort of saying, look, we don't have to have a one-size Labour policy for all of the UK. To the extent that Scots want different things on some policies, make your own decisions through your own parliament. And then I have the sort of freedom to move my party to the center in England. And in the short run, it really seemed to have worked for Blair, in the long run, it seems like it killed Labour in Scotland, right? Labour then became sort of surplus to requirements for Scottish voters. I'll skip over this. Another question that was brought up in the talk, but kind of, I guess you guys sort of assumed that the readers would understand why, is why is university so transformative? What's different about having a university degree and not going to university? What is it that goes on at the university? As someone who's been teaching now for 25, 30 years here, I question this more and more. What are we here for? What's the value of it? Is it about the instruction? Is it the intellectual classroom, contributions, or is it simply about people being introduced to a more diverse environment than they came from, and the sort of the contact hypothesis that you're less afraid of the other when you get to know them and you live with them and things like that? Or, and this will get to my last main slide, is it really about the opportunities in life that a university degree grants you, and how that makes you different from people who don't get those opportunities? My last question here is just, so yes, university or degree holders are increasing pretty monotonically in the UK and in a lot of places, but one wonders if whatever that impact of university experience is, if that's going to diminish once everybody gets access to it. If are there sort of diminishing marginal returns? One of the things that struck me is, so I looked in the index, the word globalization never appears in this book. There is a subheading somewhere about a global Brexitland or something like that. But is the immigration story that led to Brexit and the identity groups that formed around questions having to do with immigration, is that a uniquely British story, or is it an example of a more general set of stories around something like globalization? So there's a lot of work that talks about new identities and divides in established democracies around globalization, around pro-globalization, anti-globalization, and immigration is a big part of that, right? The movement of people is a big part of it. It's not the only part of it. It's also trade. It's also protection for industry. It's also how we deal with unemployment, things like that. One paper I've cited here, Antonio Stanig, that it's a couple of papers that show that the areas in the UK that were most damaged economically by Chinese competition, where their local industries were beaten essentially by imports, were the places most likely to vote for Brexit. And that isn't necessary. That correlation doesn't have to be causal through anything having to do with immigration, right? It could be a different sort of. So you get winners and losers from globalization, and the winners, one feature of the winners is they have advanced degrees, and they can become global citizens, or they have many more job opportunities. They can work in the globalized part of the national economy as opposed to the backward or derelict part of the economy. And that builds resentments, that creates divides. And so you could have the same story about identities forming that wouldn't necessarily need immigration to be part of the story. So I'm not saying that immigration isn't part of the story in the UK, but I think maybe the Brexitland story that's told in this book is a specific example of a more general phenomenon. And just sort of wonder what your thoughts were on that. The last thing I can be really short on, because Rob asked this in his own last slide. Is Brexitland relevant for anything other than Brexit and maybe immigration? One thing I would argue is that Brexit isn't done yet, right? The vote took place in 2016, but I've listed a bunch of things here. 2019 election was still about Brexit. COVID has sort of put everything on hold, but they still are going to have to figure out Northern Ireland, which I could create bigger problems. I don't think they've moved past Brexit at all. And when I say COVID-19 has put things on hold, what I mean is the disruption that Brexit may have caused is kind of confounded with the disruptions that COVID has caused. And so it's kind of hard to sort those things out. And we won't know for a little while, the extent to which the departure from the EU has actually impacted people's lives. But then the question is, does this divide, and Rob asked the same question, does this divide help us to understand current policy debates on things other than immigration and the EU? And this is the last thing, is just a question I have for you, because I don't know the answer. The battles in British politics right now over COVID restrictions, over how fast Britain should be opening up and all these other kinds of things, are those predicted by Leave and Remain? Are the same people? I know it's backbench Tories who are the most eager to open back up again. I wonder if those are the Remainers or the Leavers. So I'll just leave it there. I do have more UK specific questions, but I'll open up space for other folks to ask their own questions. So thank you very much. Really enjoyed the book.
Well, thank you so much. These were fantastic questions, and a lot of them are exactly the kind of questions that we were kind of, grappling with during writing the book. And so maybe actually the globalization question was the easiest, because we have discussed this so much during writing. And I think the reason why we left it out is because even though it is a very neat explanation that explains a lot what is happening in terms of people's objective situations, it doesn't really explain people's attitudes. And then the attitudes that you would think should be theoretically linked to those experiences of winning or losing, and those different objective experiences that people have in those two different types of areas, these attitudes were actually very weakly related to Brexit, to voting to leave or remain. And so the attitudes about immigration were much more strongly linked. And then there was what we felt was very big leap to say, oh, winners of globalization don't mind immigrants, but then the losers do, even though there is actually a lot of research saying that that doesn't work either, because actually a lot of losers don't experience competition from immigrants and don't actually dislike immigrants. And then there's some some papers saying that the winners of globalization, actually some of them did vote Brexit. There's a new paper from Jane Green, for example, arguing that there was a considerable high income Brexit vote. And so we felt that ethnocentrism was both much more elegantly theoretically linked to the outcome of interest, but also tackled straight away those attitudes, which are the bridge between your objective and your kind of realities and voting. So even though Rob has previously written about this himself, we chose to leave it out of the book. And in fact, all questions of economics, apart from when we showed that economic attitudes are weaker predictors than those identity attitudes, we have tried to stay clear of this question.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things I would also add to that. I mean, another factor here is that we feel that there is a very rich literature on the role that globalization has played in this, and we respect that literature and think it has a lot of important things. But what tends to happen in that literature is it tends to treat the sort of economic explanations as, pretty much the whole story. It's not like they ignore the other elements to it, but it's very much economics is in the foreground, other stuff is in the background, and that's fine if that's what you're interested in. But we felt, well, there was a gap here in terms of foregrounding some of the more psychological elements of what was going on, some of the more visceral identity politics elements that were going on that could explain things that were otherwise puzzling. And I can trace the genesis of this with my own work, because when I worked on UKIP, one of the things I noticed very early on is people tried to explain UKIP in economic terms, and it just didn't work. The groups that were coming together in the UKIP coalition didn't make sense economically. But if you looked at their attitudes in terms of identity issues, it did make sense. And one very striking thing, for example, during the coalition was, if you took voters who were hit hard by austerity, were economically insecure and economically pessimistic, you could divide them into two groups. The ones that switched from the Conservatives to Labour were the ones who didn't say immigration was an important issue. The ones who went from the Conservatives to UKIP were the ones who did say that immigration was an important issue. So it was almost like it was functioning as a circuit breaker there and sort of taking them down a different path. Both groups were dissatisfied, but what they saw as the answer to their dissatisfaction was very different. And one other point I did want to sort of just come back on was the point about path dependency and messaging and stuff. Or do you want me to?
No.
Do you want to? Well, then I'll let you have a go after that. The path dependency thing, I think it's really a really good point, and there are loads of points where the choices could have gone rather differently. And you made a point about failed framings, and I love that because that has happened several times on the issue of immigration. One very prominent one was Ed Miliband, the Labour leader of the opposition during the coalition, tried to push a controlling immigration message, and I think it was very revealing what happened. It was hugely attacked, indeed ridiculed, by the identity liberal, the conviction liberal end of his coalition. It was attacked, it was mocked, and because it was attacked and mocked so vocally, it therefore lost any credibility it had with its target audience. That, incidentally, is also potentially the reason why the out-Powelling Powell dynamic wouldn't have worked, because although the identity liberal wing of the Labour Party was much smaller then, it was very mobilised, very active, particularly in party elite structures. You know, Tony Benn compared Enoch Powell to a Nazi in that period, and he was a shadow cabinet minister. So one reason it wouldn't have happened is to do with elite level politics and activist level politics, which did kind of put a brake on how far Labour could go in that direction.
Yeah, and I think more broadly, I think this point about path dependence is that we actually make, I think, quite a few interventions to say we don't believe it was foretold. And the whole chapter about Scotland is supposed to be an embodiment of this argument, because we are showing that with the same demographic changes, we have seen a completely different story in Scotland. And we do say that this was because of the leaders' effects. And that's why, I should stop moving, sorry, I'm disappearing. So we do think, and this is why it's so important that we have the activation and mobilization as the kind of stages where these path dependencies could be broken. And in fact, the only, but Mike has read the book much more recently than I did, so I'm slightly worried about saying this, but I think in my brain, really what we refer to specifically when we say path dependency in the book is this phenomenon that the voters thought the Conservatives were the party of anti-immigration, even though their policies actually didn't differ from the policies of the Labour Party pretty much at any point until New Labour comes in. And then there is this kind of Tony Blair huge swathe of liberal policies to do with refugees, and of course the fateful extension of the accession of Central and Eastern European countries. So that is the element that we think is kind of in a classic understanding of path dependence, right? The stability of institutions over time, just because. But yeah.
Should we open it up to the floor?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many things, and thank you, Mike, for
thank you for reading the book so closely, and those were some really great
oh yes, and be reassured, Rob does have a PhD student who is working on why is it universities and what do they do, so we'll send him
he is
please let me know.
He's followed your advice and launched a dissertation on that question. So
okay, terrific. Well, thanks again, Marie and Rob, for a terrific response. So let's now move. We have a little, about 37 minutes for discussion. Let's move to Q&A. So I think the easiest would be if you, the members of the audience would raise their hands. Although I can call on people. At the moment, I don't see any hands raised, although I would think, given the comment and the presentation, there should be hands raised. Or alternatively, you can send me a question in the chat that I can read, and so that everyone can hear. Okay, at the moment I don't hear anything, so see anything. So maybe best to send something to me in the chat. Now, since I'm not hearing from anybody or seeing anything, I'm going to ask a question myself. So of course, one of the striking features of the story that you tell, and that's and that is in contrast to the US experience, has to do with the differing nature and history of migration. And of course, I mean, conventionally, we would say that the US has experienced over the past 40 years a largely non-white migration, people coming from, for the most part, the developing world. But obviously, the British experience is different. I mean, that is, on one hand, you have in the post-war period up until controls were imposed in the late 1960s, a largely migration that, in a way, foretold what would happen to the United States. So mainly from the ex-empire, and of course, once that was in place, continuing as a result of a chain migration. Although, despite the fact that Britain tried as much as possible to clamp down on it, and I have to say, in listening to the presentation, I'm reminded of a chapter written, I don't know, 25, 30 years ago by Zig Layton Henry, entitled "Britain, the Would-Be Zero Immigration Country." So that was how it looked at the time. In a way, if that was how it looked in the late 80s or early 90s, you wonder, why is it that the anti-immigration animus remains so strong? Okay, but then something different. I mean, chain migration continued, but then there's this large-scale migration from Eastern Europe and elsewhere on the continent. And so you have simultaneously a quote, non-white and a quote, white migration. And my question then, therefore, is in the US context, and I think in the efforts to understand anti-immigration animus, the emphasis is often on the kind of ethnic, quote, racial, whatever background of the way in which that contributes to anti-immigration animus. But think about the UK context, how much of it is just pure xenophobia? It's just fundamentally the dislike of strangers, of foreigners, as opposed to where they come from. So I guess that's question number one. And in a way, question number two is, what happened to the would-be zero immigration country? Why didn't someone immigration has been boiling. It's boiling on the continent. So of course, I guess it was Tony Blair who made the crucial decision, but why didn't someone see this could be a political problem?
I was talking for ages.
Yes, yeah. So, the answer to the second question is actually very easy, in the sense that Tony Blair actually asked some economists from London School of Economics to tell how many immigrants are likely
UCL.
to. Oh, was it UCL? Oh, sorry. And they said, there'll be a few thousand coming, but instead we've gone into millions, right? So this was a very clear kind of misunderstanding, which is again quite parallel to what happened after the war when they gave citizenship to everybody in the colonies. They didn't think those people will take up those passports and arrive at their shores, right? So it's a kind of short-sightedness that is clearly very standard in British policymaking on immigration. But the question about animus, and this is why I think ethnocentrism is such a useful theory to engage with, because ethnocentrism really is an umbrella that could explain both just resistance to strangers and newcomers, whoever they are and wherever they're from, and of course racial animus. And we actually give this example in the book. There is a very famous study by a British sociologist from the 1930s who has done a study of the impact of immigration on a small Oxfordshire town. Yes. And so, when you read this book, you're like, oh my God, this is, about today's Britain. But of course, the twist is that in 1930s, these people came from Yorkshire. So they immigrated from Yorkshire to Oxfordshire, and this resulted in this massive political upheaval in this small Oxfordshire town. And it is that quality of ethnocentrism that I think, how you form the outgroup, how you define it, and who you put inside the outgroup does vary, and it will vary from time to time, but also between voters. And so I guess that's also why we wanted to talk about ethnocentrism, because what we found is that there were people who were anti-immigrant but didn't have the kind of racial animus type attitudes who voted for Brexit, and the other way around. There were people who clearly voted on the kind of ethnocentric rejection of diversity and that kind of vision that Britain is an ethnically diverse country now, but actually they didn't particularly feel strongly about immigration. So both these attitudes can work separately and together. And I think looking forward, I I think one of the linkages between them that is often not talked about enough is that on the liberal left, on this kind of identity liberal extremes, many people would say that opposing immigration is racist. And in fact, during the Brexit campaign, this was, you know, over and over in the news media, in the papers. And I think that creates that kind of reaction, very strong reaction from people who might think they have so-called legitimate concerns with immigration and very strongly identify as not racist. And that's the element that we didn't really talk about of our book, which is that we push at this idea that one of the biggest political arguments of today's Britain is what is racism? Because racism is this extremely powerful social norm that we show in the book using some experimental studies is pretty widely shared. So most people don't want to be labeled racist. So where we put the definition of racism and how much we include in who is racist is a huge political conflict that is still playing out in British politics today, even outside of Brexit, right? So I don't know if you've heard of the war on woke that we are currently having, whereas the government is basically accusing anyone on the kind of identity liberal spectrum and very much the universities of, pushing ideologies like structural racism and things like that. So, yeah.
Same thing is going on the other side of the English Channel.
Yeah, it's a very powerful polarizing dynamic, and both sides are playing this game. I mean, Mike asked about like Corbyn's election. Well, one factor in Corbyn's election is that, yes, back in the 1980s, he was a firebrand for the old economic left, but he's also in more recent times become a firebrand for the socially liberal, identity liberal left as well. And in the hustings that were done during that campaign, he was very much rallying the audience with, we must be open to refugees, we must fight racism everywhere we find it, and all this kind of thing. So you get on the left a desire to expand the scope of normatively sanctioned behavior, which is an entirely, legitimate and understandable motivation for left-wing activists. They want these norms to stigmatize more behaviors that are intolerant, but it comes up against people who don't think that some of the concerns they have are necessarily expressions of intolerance, and react very vehemently against that. And they counter-mobilize with this charge that, this attempt to expand the norms is itself a form of intolerance. So it becomes a very, very heated debate quite quickly because this sort of feedback loop kicks in. I mean, in the British university system, we are unfortunately seeing some of the effects of those dynamics we talked about in our book hitting us institutionally at the moment. A lot of Conservative MPs see us as the enemy right now.
Yes, well, that's how conservative politicians see U.S. academics as well. So the question from Laurie Hart, Mike has some further questions. If everyone else is shy, I have other questions as well. So I invite other members of the audience to raise your hand or send me something in the chat. Laurie.
Hi, thanks so much for this incredibly interesting presentation, and Mike, for your comments. I was thinking a little bit more about the university question and thinking about some of the contradictions in cohorts that I know are university, very, very well-educated people on some of these subjects. So that provoked in me thinking about what you're seeing and what you're investigating in terms of more associational factors like kinship and social groups and neighborhoods and so on, which sometimes kind of produce a coherence of opinion or affiliation that isn't necessarily consistent on some of the other measures. So I'm just wondering how those factors might be consistent with or somehow not consistent with what you're seeing. Are there fractures within kinship groups that have been remarkable? Are there fractures within communities that are otherwise, groups of friends and so on? Because that's been a kind of intense question also in the US.
I mean, in terms of fractures within groups of friends and families over Brexit, yes, there have, very often generationally. as well as across the education divide. It was kind of a commonplace of political commentary in sort of 2017, 2018. How am I going to talk to my parents about Brexit? They're all horrible leavers, this kind of thing. In terms of the broader issue, you're right. A part of this, at least the sort of reinforcement story with this, is social, geographical, occupational segregation by education. And that interacts with the electoral system, of course, as well, because the graduate, Remain, identity liberal groups tend to cluster together quite strongly. The Leave vote is more evenly spread out. That gives the Leave vote a geographical advantage. But, you know, in our own university department, I think the only Leave voter was the receptionist. And when I did work at the BBC, on the EU referendum, like there were probably 2 Leave voters in a room of 150 people. So there are clearly segmentations of that kind. It was beyond the scope of our book to get into that side of the story. That's a very sociological story rather than a political science story. But I'm very much sure that that is a big part of the story that needs to be unpacked. Want to add anything to that?
No, yeah.
Okay, terrific. David Fitzgerald.
Yes, so I have a general question about the sources of public opinion and the extent to which you think that's being led or followed by 2 sources. One is politicians and one is the media.
Yes, so we predominantly use academic sources. So in Britain, we have this long-running kind of series of social surveys.
Like drivers.
Sorry. So data sources, you mean for?
No, drivers. He means drivers.
Oh, drivers.
Okay.
Not
Causal drivers rather than methodology.
Causal drivers. Yeah. Oh, okay. Sorry. Yes, I completely got that question wrong. You go there.
I mean, in short, yes. I mean, the way we've tried to think about it in the book, and there's only limited extent to which one could do that empirically, because I mean, obviously, you don't get to run multiple country. You know, we don't have access to the multiverse, so we can't run the country 5 different ways to see how it sort of works. But we tend to think that that political elites are very important in this story. We're big believers in the power of priming and framing and so forth. And one neat thing about the British context, in a sense, is that you do have one part of the country where all of this is played out very differently, and where there was another referendum with another pair of campaigns and another set of political elite reactions, which was Scotland. And what you see there is just how powerful elite framing and mobilisation can be, in terms of, not in terms of creating these feelings of us against them, but in terms of fleshing out who is us and who is them. Because what we show, and this is contra a lot of the Scottish Nationalist Party's own narrative about itself and about Scotland, is that ethnocentric nationalism is just as prevalent in Scotland as it is in England. And indeed, you get 30 or 40% of Scottish voters who say things like English people who move to Scotland shouldn't have the right to vote. And should have to wait a while before getting access to Scottish welfare benefits and all this kind of thing. So just like the people of Banbury, they see the English as, to some extent, other. But what's different about the Scottish context is the SNP has, from the very beginning, extensively downplayed that kind of othering ethnocentric nationalism in terms of what Scottishness is. And they've done it for 2 reasons, I think. One is they had an easily identifiable enemy to focus on anyway, which was the English and London, and a political enemy in terms of London, the Conservative parties, the Westminster government. So they could make this a political outgroup story quite easily. But secondly, they recognised from the outset that ethnocentric Scottish nationalism wasn't going to provide a majority coalition, because an awful lot of Scots feel British as much as they feel Scottish. So in order to build a broad coalition, they had to reach out beyond that and start talking about how Scotland would be a better, more liberal, more diverse country if it was, freed from the English and so on. So it took the coalition in a completely different direction, because the way these things were packaged together was very, very different. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how we at least try to treat the issue in the book.
But I think it is true that we do have an omission in the book, right? Which is where we talk about activation and how the immigration issue has become an activating issue. It is true, and I think Mike already pointed this out as well, that we do skim over how it became such an issue, right? So, and partly this is because there is already a lot of research, again, on how the media portrays immigrants, and how frequently they publish on it and things like that. But it's also because our book is already very long, so we decided that we have to draw the line somewhere. Yes, but it is true that we do skim over the activation part of it to focus on the mobilization into politics, let's say.
Okay, a question from David Jacobson and then Oriana Halverson.
Thank you. Yeah, no, first I have to apologize because I tuned in late for reasons out of my control. So I hope I'm not asking a question well dealt with. But following up on one of the commentators on this question of the impact on the university, and is this bringing in people, making them essentially part of the winners, so to speak, which I assume means in some economic sense. I would be very curious, and this will lead to a question, that I'd be very curious because not every university graduate is, quote, a winner in that regard. And if that could be passed, and if even the non-winners in economic terms are becoming Brexit-like, sort of supporters, that would be very challenging because it suggests there's a sort of cultural factor going at work. And I imagine that may be the case. And so I'm curious, and again, you may have addressed this already, but how much is a skepticism of the elites, at least in England, how much is the skepticism of elites at work in those who support Brexit? And this would go with arguments of people like Christopher Lash, right, that this is very much at work.
I mean, yes, it is one of the predictors of Brexit vote. We earlier in the presentation, we're talking about this political change where voters felt abandoned by the parties and the party elites started becoming more alike and less like the voters. And there's definitely this sense in the electorate as well. It's not a main focus in our book because our book is supposed to be about diversity and identity. And so we leave that a little bit as a side story, but it definitely has been connected. But on your first point, which is, do different universities have those different economic effects? Of course. So we have the same system as in the US, right? Which is you have the kind of Ivy League equivalent, which is Russell Group universities. And then there are some universities that are more like, what's it called? Community colleges type, which don't offer you as many economic benefits as you've graduated. But the problem that we have faced with is that I'm not convinced there's enough data on this, basically. So that again is a really good idea to pursue, kind of in the future, I would say, to try to get that data. Because the usual kind of social attitude surveys, I don't think split up people in terms of what university experience they had exactly.
I mean, one thing you can use to proxy for it somewhat is age, because older graduates have often graduated in situations where university degree provided a larger economic premium. They also came in more favorable economic times, whereas graduates in the last 10 years have not had a great time on the job market, not a great time on the housing market, and so on and so forth. And so if it is interacting with economic security or insecurity, you would expect to see a difference between those two groups. But on the whole, you don't tend to see much, or we didn't find much evidence of a difference between those two groups in terms of the effect of university degree on these attitudes, which in turn then led them into this kind of politics. So yeah, I mean, there's more work to be done on that, certainly.
Definitely, yeah.
If I could make a quick follow-up, it's interesting, your comment, because that does suggest, that universities are having some, broadly understood, are having some kind of cultural impact.
Yeah, I mean, to just give a little bit of an advert for my PhD student's work, his name's Ralph Becker, watch out for him, smart guy. He has found using cohort study data that has come back to people, lifelong cohort study data, so with sweeps every 5 to 6 years, like the classic 7up documentary and all that. We have several of those studies in Britain. We're very lucky to have them. He looked at the one that started in 1970, so those people are now 51. And he shows that, essentially, if you control for people's attitudes when they're teenagers and then look at what happens to them after, whether they go to university or not, you see a really strong liberalizing effect on things such as racial prejudice, authoritarianism, and it then lasts all the way through the rest of life. And it seems to be that period where they're at university where they diverge, where their attitudes move in a more liberal direction than you could have predicted from the kind of people they were going in, which, like you say, would suggest that universities do have a genuine social impact in terms of their effect on their students. Yeah. He's now trying to unpack what that means, and I don't know what his answer is for that yet.
Very reassuring for a university professor to hear. So, Oriana Halverson.
Hello. So I wanted to ask about, like, in the end of chapter 1, the book mentioned that the UK is not yet experiencing as severe of a culture conflict as the United States. So I was wondering about the potential role of political structures, in particular the role of the two-party system versus the multi-party systems in perpetuating or lessening these sorts of like culture conflicts and divides. And so sort of given that, you know, nations which we generally associate, at least in the US, with very like stable governance, like New Zealand, Norway, the Netherlands, Denmark, they all practice a multi-party system. So I was wondering if that sort of political structure is, you know, quite integral to forming maybe like the basis for these sorts of conflicts, or if it has more to do with either like the historical context, the social demographics, the relative degrees of like homogeneity versus heterogeneity within these populaces and these different nations. Is a greater contributor to that stability versus countries like the US, for example.
Okay, terrific. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think the answer is it's a little bit of both, because Britain's a little bit unusual in terms of its party system, because it's not a pure two-party system to the extent that the US is, but it's much more two-party dominant than some of the countries you name, like Norway, also the Netherlands and so forth. And that's important, I think, relative to the US for two reasons. Firstly, the smaller parties here play a kind of moderating role. In particular, we're seeing it at the moment with the Conservative Party. They've gone quite strongly to the right over Brexit and some of these issues. They're now, you know, as I was mentioning, looking to sort of start culture war type arguments, but they have a threat on their kind of the Liberal Democrats, who are basically a party that people who don't like that kind of culture war politics, but are quite economically right-wing and not very keen on the Labour Party, could vote for. So, you know, imagine if the moderate Republicans could vote for a party that wasn't the Democrats and was kind of economically conservative, but wasn't going in for a lot of this socially conservative stuff. It might drag some of the Republicans back to the centre, knowing that they had a threat of that kind. And the second thing is about the structure of the two parties themselves. Our parties are not as porous as the American parties. So MPs are not selected directly through primary elections. They're chosen by the party elites through rather convoluted processes that tend, on the whole, to have a moderating impact. And there's just no such thing as being primaried in the British system. Well,
there were 10 primaries in 2010, I think, but
since, Cameron abandoned it. But you know, the thing you get in the US where people get like the threat from their extreme flank because they'll chuck you out and replace you with a different MP, that basically never happens in our system. So once you've been elected as an MP, if you moderate to move towards the centre ground voter, you don't face any threat of losing your seat. The only way you'd lose your seat is if you annoy your party leadership, and the party leadership itself tends to be more moderating as well. So it's both of those things, the existence of a centrist party as a safety valve, and also these kind of the less porous, more centralised party structures, I think both play a role.
Okay, terrific. A question from Suzanne Liddell. Could either of you comment on the role of Putin's Russia in firing up the Brexit storm in an already divided UK?
Yeah, I mean, I
Not
think
easily.
No, but I do think the whole trouble with misinformation and those influences of the campaign as well were just something that we didn't feel we could cover and do justice to whilst telling the other long-term story. So I do think there's now increasingly research on that aspect. So we didn't really, I mean, if you read the book, you don't see too much about the campaign. The only time when we actually raise the campaign is when we are contrasting it with the Scottish campaign to make that point about what kind of influence the elites can have, and how, you know, just making this point that demography is not destiny, and in fact you can change the path of history if you make different choices. So we don't really focus on campaign as such very much in the book at all.
One thing I would also say about that is, you know, there clearly are like worries about malign influences in British politics, and this has come up a number of times. There's been a number of Commons investigations about it, and it is an ongoing concern. Difficult for researchers from our kind of tradition to investigate effectively, because it's just very hard to find any kind of reliable data on it to sort of quantify it. But what I would say is, even if that was a sort of small thumb on the scale, it didn't create the kinds of fractures and tensions that these campaigns ended up mobilizing. It might have made the campaigns to mobilize them a bit more effective, but it didn't generate the social divisions that these campaigns organized into politics. Those were there waiting to be ignited, in a sense.
Okay, terrific. So we're nearing the end of the session. So we have two questioners. I'm going to ask you both to speak and then ask Rob and Maria to respond to the two questions. So first, Hiroshi Motomura and then Javier Escandel.
Thanks. This is really fascinating. And so let me ask you a question that is maybe very uninformed on my part, but I'm trying to imagine a counterfactual, a really big counterfactual, which is that Brexit is not available to the British electorate to be the expression of what led to Brexit. And I'm trying to think about the hydraulics of the issues here. And what would your book have been about if it had not been about Brexit? And has Brexit emboldened or increased pressure on those issues, whatever they may be, or has it released pressure on those issues? And part of the reason I ask the question, of course, is that I'm trying to figure out what are the analogs, what are the available pressure points. That's I realize that's quite open-ended, but it's very counterfactualist to your book.
Great, thanks, Hiroshi. Before answering, let's hear from Javier Escandel. Javier.
Thank you very much for the talk. Very quickly, I would be actually interested in hearing from migrant communities as well. It seems like a book that addresses diversity. And of course, I haven't read the book, and my apologies for that, but I would be interested to see how migrants from below, whether first generation, second generation, third generation migrants, have had somehow a capacity to shape the debates about Brexit and the impacts of Brexit on not only in the country, but on migrants themselves. So, and of course, I'm thinking that there might be a huge variety of positions among migrants, depending on whether you're a migrant living in Scotland or a migrant living in England and so forth. And whether you, again, different types of migrants from different generations, from different times, might have really different incentives to participate or get mobilized and activated for discussions that seems to put migration at the center, but their voices are not necessarily captured in your study. So I just, again, maybe you could help me, point me in the direction where I could get this kind of data on this kind of generational and perspective. Thank you.
Okay, terrific. So Rob and Maria.
So Hiroshi, first to tackle your question, well, actually, we know exactly what the book would be about because we started writing this book before Brexit happened. It was supposed to be a book about the Labour Party and why the Labour Party struggles to find an electoral coalition. So those issues of, and in fact, there is a chapter in the book, which is basically what the book was supposed to be about, which is this changing electoral coalition of the Labour Party and how those better educated and diverse electorates basically became the majority of voters of the Labour Party, and the kinds of changes that this pushes on the Labour Party, the kind of cost that it comes with, etc. So that is what the book would have been about. In short, would have just expanded on this as well. I guess the only thing that would have scuppered the book entirely is if Labour Party had in fact in the meantime won an election. This would have been a major problem for our narrative, I think. Xavier, that's where I come from. I write about immigrants normally and ethnic minorities. So this is actually, I think, the first time I wrote about the kind of majority British public opinion. And one of the reasons why I moved to write about majority public opinion is because there is almost no data on immigrants and ethnic minorities. So sadly, we've been applying for surveys. I must have had like 3 or 4 applications, and it's always too expensive. And the comment is always that it's over the limit of the funding body. So the last time we were able to do a proper study like this was in 2010. So this is now old data, but it's excellent data if you're interested. It only covers non-white immigrants, but again, it was just a cost issue. And it's called Ethnic Minority British Election Study. So I'm directing you to this if you are interested.
Yeah, just to follow up on Maria. So yeah, on the first point, we both of us have been having that conversation about the way that the left's electoral coalition was becoming harder to hold together because of the emergence of these new issues, which I think is a story that you see a lot in the US as well. But what Brexit made clear to us is that actually this was a symmetrical problem, and that there were problems that the right were going to have to wrestle with from this mobilization, which I think we are seeing playing out in the Johnson administration now as well, because just as the left, you had like economically left-wing but socially conservative, older, lower education voters who weren't necessarily happy with a drift towards a form of open border identity liberalism that made them uncomfortable. On the right, you're having a lot of economically conservative but quite socially liberal voters who aren't happy with the drift of the Johnson government. So, both parties in a sense have to deal with a big kid on the seesaw and how to get the seesaw back balanced. And but what Brexit kind of fortunately for us from an academic perspective made us realize is that that both of these sides of the story needed to be told. And then on the issue, I just want to say one thing about the issue of migrants and migrant voice. That is an issue we wrestled with a little bit more directly in one chapter in particular, because in fact, some of the story of the politics of Britain in the last 20 years has been influenced by, again, specific decisions made about citizenship. I mentioned that Cameron's migration target was a very consequential choice that could have gone differently. Another one is, why didn't Tony Blair liberalize citizenship laws at the same time as he opened up migration to the EU? Because the overwhelming majority of EU citizens had no voting rights in the EU referendum, have no voting rights in British domestic general elections, which is not true of the first wave of migrants who came from the former empire. They had voting rights from day one and still do. And if the 3 million plus EU citizen adults who'd been living here for more than 5 years, for example, had voting rights in 2015, that election could have been very different. And indeed, the Scottish referendum was in part, the balance there was in part tipped by migrants from the EU and from further afield, all of whom the Scottish government did give voting rights to, and most of whom didn't really seem to see much of an argument for independence. So they tended to be very much on the no side. So in a sense, the Scottish government shot themselves in the foot in that regard, just as the Blair government had earlier ended up shooting themselves in the foot. And those are two puzzling decisions that could have gone very differently, and where migrants ended up playing a role through whether or not they had a voice in the outcome. And it does show why the migrant voice in the outcome can be a really important question to sort of spotlight.
Okay, so this has been a terrific discussion, but I'm afraid we're going to have to bring it to an end. I want to thank Rob and Maria for a terrific, very stimulating presentation and for wonderful exchange with the audience. I want to thank Mike for a very stimulating, critical but friendly comment. And I want to thank all of you, of course, for joining us, and to remind you that we will reconvene on Friday, February 4th from 12 to 1:30 for a discussion of a very interesting book by Myrna Safi called Migration and Inequality, with a comment by Andres Villarreal. So have a good weekend, everybody. Stay safe and healthy, and looking forward to seeing you in the very near future. To my students, we'll now segue to the discussion. I've sent you that link. Okay, goodbye, everyone. Hope to see you soon.
Thanks for having us, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, so now we go